The trial begins. The courtroom was filled with an unnerving silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any sound. It seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the room, as the members of the jury, the spectators, and the lawyers awaited the beginning of the trial. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the figure standing at the center of it all. Tasha Davis. Tasha had never imagined her life would come to this, standing before the court, accused of a crime she couldn't take back. She could feel the weight of every eye on her. The walls seemed to close in as she stood, her body stiff with tension, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't dare look up. Not at the judge, not at the jury, not even at her daughter. Tasha had been a mother at the age of 22, a mother who had fought tooth and nail to make a life for her daughter, Layla. But over the years, the weight of single motherhood, the pressure of working 2 jobs, and the unrelenting burden of financial struggles had taken a toll on her. There had been times when she had felt utterly lost, when the sense of being trapped in a cycle of struggle had felt too much to bear. And then there was the night of the accident. It had been a mistake, a terrible, reckless mistake. One moment, she was at a bar with some old friends, trying to unwind after a long week. The next, she had made the fateful decision to drive herself home. The alcohol clouded her judgment, and when the headlights of another vehicle appeared unexpectedly in front of her, it was already too late. The crash was a blur, a mess of twisted metal and glass. The sound of tires screeching, the sickening crunch of impact, and then the overwhelming silence that followed. Tasha remembered stumbling out of the car in a daze, her legs trembling beneath her. She saw the damage, the broken bodies of the people she had hit, the overturned vehicles, the screams of those who had witnessed it all. But panic took over. Fear gripped her, and in that moment, she ran. The authorities found her a few hours later. She hadn't gotten far. But the damage had been done. The media had reported the incident with sensational headlines, calling it a reckless crime, a life lost because of one woman's selfish choice. 7 people were dead, and Tasha had been the one behind the wheel. She was guilty, no matter how much she tried to deny it. Now here she was, standing in front of a courtroom full of strangers who saw only the woman who had caused so much pain, not the mother who had once dreamed of a better life for her child. The judge, a man of considerable age with silver hair and a stern expression, looked down at her with disapproval. Tasha Davis, the judge's voice boomed, cutting through the thick silence. You are accused of causing a fatal car accident while driving under the influence of alcohol. 7 lives were lost as a result of your actions. Do you understand the severity of these charges? Tasha's throat tightened, and she struggled to breathe. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. The room seemed to close in on her, but she nodded slowly. She had no choice. The truth was undeniable. The judge continued, his voice steady but harsh. For the crime of drunk driving and causing the deaths of 7 people, you face the possibility of life imprisonment or even death. How do you plead? A wave of dizziness washed over Tasha. The words felt like a punch to her gut, each one harder than the last. Her hand tightened around the small piece of paper she had been given earlier. She tried to steady herself, to gather the strength to speak. But the words didn't come easily. Finally, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Guilty, Your Honor. I plead guilty to all charges. The room seemed to exhale in unison. It wasn't unexpected. She had already admitted to the crime to the authorities, but hearing it spoken aloud, in the hushed tension of the courtroom, made it feel all the more real. The murmurs started, voices rising in shock and disbelief, as the court tried to process the weight of what had just been said. Tasha didn't look up. She couldn't. If she did, she knew she would break. She had to hold it together for Layla, her daughter, who was sitting in the front row beside a man Tasha barely recognized. Daniel, her estranged husband, the man who had been a distant figure in her life for years, but still shared a connection with her in the form of their daughter. Layla, her beautiful daughter, was 8 years old. She had eyes full of innocence, eyes that hadn't yet learned the cruelty of the world. She was still at that age where the smallest things could make her smile, where her love for her mother was as pure as it had been when she was a toddler. Tasha's heart twisted as she stole a glance at her daughter. Layla sat with her back straight, her tiny hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. It was clear that she didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but she felt the tension. Layla could always sense when something was wrong, and today her world had been turned upside down. Beside Layla sat Daniel, his face unreadable. He had always been distant, detached from the realities of Tasha's struggles. The two had separated years ago, their marriage fractured by the weight of their differences. But now, in the face of this trial, Daniel seemed to be more present than he had been in years. He leaned toward Layla, whispering something to her that Tasha couldn't hear, but she saw Layla nod. Then the judge spoke again, his voice carrying an air of finality. For the crime of drunk driving and causing the deaths of 7 individuals, I hereby sentence you, Tasha Davis, to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The words struck Tasha like a bolt of lightning. Her breath hitched in her throat. She had expected something severe, but hearing it laid out so coldly felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. She stood there, numb, as the judge continued, but it was the sound of Layla's voice that broke through the haze. "No, Mom." Layla's voice rang out in a sharp cry, a small, desperate plea. "You didn't do it. You didn't mean to hurt anyone." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. Layla's words seemed to echo throughout the room, drawing every eye to her. She saw the little girl rise to her feet, tears streaming down her face, her tiny body shaking with emotion. Tasha's heart ached as she watched her daughter, feeling the weight of her innocence and the depth of her love for her mother. But there was no way to undo the damage, no way to take back what had happened. Tasha's vision blurred with tears as she turned to the side, her face crumbling in silent anguish. Her heart shattered as she realized the full extent of the mess she had made. From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel's face, set, calm, and yet oddly distant. He had always been distant. She hadn't expected him to do anything. But seeing him now, hearing Layla's desperate plea, made Tasha realize that the person she truly needed, her true anchor, was her daughter. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Layla sobbed uncontrollably, her cries breaking the stillness. "Mom, please. They're lying. You didn't do it. You didn't kill anyone. They're wrong, Mom." Tasha was being pulled away, dragged from the stand by the bailiffs as she screamed in frustration. "You're lying, Daniel. You told me it would be okay. You said I wouldn't go to prison." Her voice cracked as she fought against their grip. But the words hung in the air, unanswered, and the courtroom fell into disarray as the gavel slammed down again and again, trying to restore order. Through it all, Layla's sobs filled the space, echoing in Tasha's ears as her daughter's cries for justice seemed to be the only thing that still made sense. The past comes to light. The days following the courtroom chaos passed in a blur for Tasha. The gavel's final thud had been the sound of her life crashing down. She couldn't escape the reality of what had happened, even in the cold isolation of her holding cell. It was a quiet, lonely existence now, one filled with too much time to think, too much time to dwell on her mistakes. The images from that night played over and over again in her mind, more vivid than any memory should be. Each time, she saw the same thing: the blinding headlights, the sickening sound of metal crumpling under pressure, the fleeting glance of the victims' faces before it all went black. She saw herself, stumbling out of the wrecked car, disoriented and terrified, before she ran. Always running, driven by the irrational fear that consumed her in that moment. She had run from the scene, run from the responsibility, and run from the people who would have been her witnesses to her deepest shame. But there was another version of the story, one she had refused to acknowledge for a long time. A version that only Layla, with her innocent eyes, could see. Layla was always the light in the darkness of Tasha's life, the one thing she knew she had done right. But now, Even Layla's light couldn't drown out the weight of her guilt. The nights were the hardest. They stretched endlessly before her, the walls of her cell pressing in with every hour that passed. The thoughts of her daughter, her beautiful, strong, innocent daughter, kept her awake. Tasha had always tried to shield Layla from the world's harshness, but now she had failed her in the worst possible way. Layla had begged, had cried out for her, and Tasha had no answer to give. What could she say? How could she explain that it had all gone so terribly wrong? The memories of her life with Daniel, her estranged husband, haunted her too. She thought back to the days before everything fell apart, the days when they had been a family, the days when they had dreamed together of a future full of promise and hope. Daniel had once been her rock, the man who promised her that they would weather life's storms together. But when the storms hit, he had been the first to pull away, leaving her to bear the brunt of everything. They had separated years ago, when Layla was just a baby. Daniel had never really understood how hard it was for Tasha to hold everything together, to balance a job she hated with raising their child, and all the while, trying to keep up the facade of a perfect life. The stress of it had worn Tasha thin, and when the drinking started, Daniel hadn't been there. He had distanced himself from the chaos of their lives, retreating into his work, his own world. And now, when Tasha needed him most, he was sitting quietly in the courtroom, a figure who looked like a stranger rather than someone who had once vowed to stand by her. The last time Tasha had seen Daniel, he had looked so different, older, more distant. His crisp, expensive suit seemed like armor to her, a sign of the life he had built without her. He had been successful, professionally at least, and had remarried a few years after their separation. Tasha had heard the rumors of his new family, his perfect life. All of it had seemed so far removed from her reality. She couldn't help but feel abandoned, even though it was a decision she had made long ago. But now, seeing him again in the courtroom, there was something about him, something in his eyes, that made her wonder if he felt even the slightest sense of guilt. The trial had been a blur of lawyers, testimony, and facts laid out with ruthless clarity. But one thing had stuck with her, Layla's plea. The moment her daughter had stood up in that courtroom and cried out for her mother, it had sent a shockwave through Tasha's heart. Layla, so young, so innocent, didn't understand the full weight of the situation, but she understood enough to know that her mother wasn't the monster the world was painting her to be. Layla's plea wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was a revelation. It made Tasha realize that despite everything she had done, despite the lives lost and the pain she had caused, her daughter still believed in her. Layla still saw the woman who had once taken care of her, the woman who had kissed her goodnight every night, who had cheered her on at school events, and who had worked tirelessly to provide her with a better life. Tasha had failed in so many ways, but her daughter's love was unwavering. Layla's belief in her was the only thing that kept her going, the only thing that made her feel like there could still be hope. But even with Layla's belief, Tasha knew that the law had its own unforgiving way of delivering justice. She was guilty, there was no denying that. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The blood alcohol content in her system had been well over the legal limit. The witnesses who had seen her flee the scene, those who had watched in horror as the accident unfolded, had all testified that she had run without a second thought. There was no getting around it. She had made a choice that night, and the consequences of that choice would echo for the rest of her life. As the days in her cell dragged on, Tasha began to consider what Layla's words had truly meant. "Mom, you didn't mean to hurt anyone. You didn't do it." What did Layla see that Tasha couldn't? Was it possible that Layla could forgive her, even if the rest of the world couldn't? Could she forgive herself? Tasha didn't have the answers, but there was one thing she did know for certain. She could not let her daughter's plea for her go unanswered. She had to try to make things right. For Layla's sake, for her own sake. The clock on the wall above her cell door ticked away the seconds, and in the stillness of that small, lonely room, Tasha made a vow to herself. She would fight. She would do whatever it took to make sure that Layla didn't grow up without a mother, without the love and guidance that only a mother could give. And even if it meant facing the darkest parts of herself, the parts she had tried to bury for so long, she would do it. The next few days passed in a haze, filled with visits from her lawyer, Natalie, and the constant flow of paperwork and discussions about the retrial. But through it all, Tasha couldn't shake the thought of Layla, the little girl who had stood up in front of everyone, who had fought for her mother's honor in a way that no one else had. Natalie, her lawyer, had been preparing a case to present during the retrial. She knew it would be an uphill battle, especially given the severity of the charges. But she was determined to find any angle that might bring Tasha's sentence down. She talked about evidence that could be used to challenge the prosecution's case, about finding loopholes in the law, but Tasha wasn't sure that any of it mattered. What good was a reduced sentence if her daughter had to live with the fact that she had caused so much pain? Tasha couldn't change the past, but she could change what came next. The thought of facing the future, a future that seemed so uncertain and terrifying, was overwhelming. But Layla's voice, the sound of her daughter's belief in her, kept her grounded. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for redemption. A chance to rise above the mistakes, to take responsibility, and to heal. But before any of that could happen, she had to face the court again. She had to stand before the judge and plead her case once more. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for the chance to be the mother Layla believed her to be. A glimmer of hope. The days in the holding cell stretched on like an endless desert, each hour dragging its feet and leaving Tasha feeling more isolated, more consumed by her guilt. The thought of Layla, so young and full of love, was the only thing that anchored her to some semblance of hope. How had it all gone so wrong? The questions haunted her in the quiet of the cell, replaying the tragic events over and over. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had been living her life as if she were simply going through the motions, trying to survive rather than live. Natalie, Tasha's lawyer, had visited her frequently over the past week, updating her on the progress of the retrial preparations. But no matter how hard she tried to reassure Tasha, the weight of her actions continued to press down on her like an unbearable load. The evidence was stacked high, and the prosecution seemed relentless in its pursuit of the harshest sentence. There were moments, brief flashes of optimism, where Natalie believed she could chip away at the case, finding a crack in the system. But Tasha had no such optimism left. In her heart, she knew what she had done, and she couldn't undo it. Still, there was something that kept her going. Layla's faith in her. Tasha couldn't understand it. How could her daughter still believe in her, still love her with such an open heart? She had done so much wrong, too much to ever be forgiven, or so she thought. But Layla's words echoed in her mind, especially the one simple truth her daughter had spoken in court. You didn't mean to hurt anyone. You didn't do it. It was almost as if Layla saw a side of her that she couldn't see herself, one that wasn't defined by mistakes or failures, but by the potential for growth, for change. Tasha had to believe that. She had to find a way to believe in herself again for Layla's sake. For Layla, who was still so small, still so tender with hope, despite everything the world had thrown her way. One morning, as Tasha sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, a new thought began to take shape in her mind, one that didn't come from her lawyer or from the trial's endless paperwork, but from something deeper. It wasn't just about pleading guilty or trying to get a lighter sentence. It was about redemption. It was about taking the responsibility for what she had done and finding a way to show her daughter that she could rise above her past, no matter how dark it had been. Tasha's path to redemption, she realized, wasn't going to be handed to her. She couldn't just sit back and wait for the court to show mercy or for someone else to make it right. If she truly wanted to make amends, to show Layla that there was more to her than just the mistakes she'd made, she had to do the hard work herself. And that meant confronting the most painful parts of her past, the parts that had pushed her to drink, to escape, and to shut down when life had been too much to bear. It was then that Natalie visited with a proposal that took Tasha by surprise. "We've been looking at the case, Tasha," Natalie said as she sat down across from her in the small visiting room. "The prosecution has a solid case, but we're not entirely without options. There's a chance we could argue for a reduced sentence if you're willing to participate in a rehabilitation program. It's a long shot, but it might work. It's not much, but it could be the key to reducing your sentence." Tasha blinked in disbelief. A rehabilitation program. She knew it wasn't a guarantee, but it felt like a lifeline, a way out of the overwhelming darkness that had consumed her for so long. It wasn't a free pass, and it didn't make up for the lives lost that night. But it was something. It was a path forward, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but the life she wanted to give Layla. A life without shame and guilt weighing on her every step. Tasha nodded slowly. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said, her voice low but determined. "I know it's not enough to fix what I've done, but I'll work hard to show Layla that I'm not a lost cause. I'll do it for her." Natalie smiled, relief and cautious optimism in her eyes. "That's the spirit, Tasha. If we push for this rehabilitation program, it's not a guarantee, but it's a strong argument. We can present it as a sign of your commitment to change. But we need to be ready. This won't be easy, and the judge might not buy it. Still, we have to try." As the days passed, Tasha threw herself into preparing for the retrial. But it wasn't just about legal strategies or evidence anymore. She had made a decision. She was going to face her past head-on, no matter how painful it might be. In the quiet of her cell, she began to think more about the reasons behind her actions. The deep, searing pain she had been trying to numb for years. She thought about her childhood, about growing up in a neighborhood where survival often meant losing pieces of yourself. Her parents had struggled to make ends meet, and Tasha had learned early on to bury her emotions, to put up walls to protect herself from the constant disappointment she saw in the faces of those she loved. She had been taught to bottle things up, to keep moving forward, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. The pressure to be perfect, to be strong, had never let up, and when she couldn't cope anymore, the drinking had started. It was a coping mechanism, a way to escape. She had never learned how to deal with pain properly. No one had ever shown her how to heal from trauma, how to ask for help. Instead, she had tried to numb the hurt, to push it away, until it all exploded that fateful night. But now, in the quiet of her isolation, she could see it more clearly. She was ashamed of how she had tried to escape her feelings. She regretted the choices she had made, but she wasn't going to let those mistakes define her forever. The most painful truth was that she had hurt people. She had caused lives to end, and there was no running away from that. But there was still a chance to rebuild, to face what she had done, and work toward earning back the trust of her daughter and the people she had wronged. Tasha wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time since the accident, she felt like she could breathe again. She could see a glimmer of hope, the possibility of redemption, even if it was a long and difficult road. She had to prove to herself, to Layla, and to the world that she was capable of change. That afternoon, as she prepared for the next day of the retrial, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The pieces were starting to fall into place. She wasn't the person she had been when the accident happened. She wasn't the woman who had run away. She was someone who had made a terrible mistake, but was willing to fight for a better future. And that was the first step toward finding her way back. Layla's face, her bright, trusting eyes, was never far from Tasha's mind. She had to hold on to the belief that she could do better, that she could be the mother Layla believed her to be. And no matter how long it took, she would keep fighting. For herself, for her daughter, and for the possibility of a second chance. The courtroom confrontation. The day of the retrial had arrived. The familiar weight of dread settled on Tasha as she sat in the holding area, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Her mind was a whirl of thoughts, doubts, and fleeting glimmers of hope. The past few weeks had been a blur of preparation. Discussions with Natalie, long sessions of soul-searching, and finally, the decision to confront her past. But now, as she waited for the doors to open and the trial to start, the reality of what lay ahead loomed larger than ever before. She had done everything she could to prepare herself, but the fear still gnawed at her. The prosecution would not make things easy. They had already painted her as the villain, the woman who had caused the death of 7 people, and there was no denying the brutality of that truth. But for the first time since that fateful night, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just going to sit back and let her past define her. She was going to stand up for herself, for Layla, and for the possibility of change. Tasha glanced at her reflection in the small mirror by her cell door. The woman staring back at her was tired, her face gaunt from sleepless nights spent wrestling with the weight of her own guilt. But there was something else there, too, something she hadn't seen in a long time. It was the spark of determination, the desire to show the world that she was capable of more than the mistake she had made. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she was ready to face it head-on. As the guards escorted her into the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The space felt smaller than it had during the preliminary trial, despite the room being filled with people. The air was heavy, filled with expectation. Tasha's heart raced as she walked toward the defendant's table, her legs trembling, but she pushed through. She had to be strong. For Layla. For herself. As she took her seat, her gaze flickered toward the gallery. There in the front row sat Layla and Daniel. Layla was as beautiful as ever, her innocent face a stark contrast to the heavy emotions swirling around them. She was sitting close to Daniel, clutching his hand as if drawing strength from him. But her eyes were fixed on Tasha, the look in them one of quiet support, unwavering belief. Layla hadn't given up on her, and that alone made Tasha want to fight with everything she had. Tasha's eyes met Daniel's for just a moment, and she saw something she hadn't expected, something softer than the cool detachment he had shown her in the past. There was concern in his eyes, an unspoken question. Did he believe in her now? Did he see something different in her than he had before? Tasha couldn't tell, but she didn't have time to focus on him. She had to focus on the trial. The judge entered, his black robes swishing as he took his seat behind the bench. The courtroom fell silent, the proceedings beginning in the usual fashion. The prosecution made its opening statement, painting Tasha as a reckless driver who had caused the deaths of 7 people and fled the scene to save herself. The evidence was clear, they said, and the law was unforgiving. Tasha listened to the words, each one like a strike to her chest. It was hard not to feel like the villain, like the woman who had ruined lives. The guilt threatened to swallow her whole, but she refused to let it. She wasn't just here to be punished. She was here to show that there was more to her than this one moment. When it was time for her defense, Tasha stood up slowly, her hands trembling, but she refused to look away from the judge or the jury. She had to speak the truth. She had to take responsibility, but she also had to show that she was willing to change, to face the consequences, and try to make things right. Your Honor, she began, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength as she continued. I stand before you today guilty of a crime I can never undo. I took lives that night. I made a choice that I can never take back. And for that, I am sorry. Every day, I carry that guilt with me. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I can't. All I can do is ask for the chance to prove that I am more than the mistakes I've made. Her voice faltered as she glanced at Layla, her heart aching at the sight of her daughter. Layla was watching her, her eyes wide, full of an emotion that Tasha couldn't fully understand. She wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but there was nothing she could do except stand there and speak the truth. I know that I am responsible for the pain I've caused, Tasha continued. I will never be able to undo the suffering I caused to those families, to the people who lost their loved ones. I can't take back the lives that were lost. But what I can do is spend the rest of my life working to make things right. I'm willing to face the consequences of my actions, but I also ask for the opportunity to show that I am capable of change. That I can be a better person, not just for myself, but for my daughter." She paused, swallowing hard, trying to find the words that would make them understand. "I am asking for the chance to prove that I can change. That I can heal and be a mother to Layla, not just a criminal who abandoned her. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a miracle. But I will do everything in my power to show that I am not the person who ran that night. I am not the woman who gave up. I am someone who can learn, who can grow, and who can give back to this world in a way I never thought possible." The silence in the courtroom felt deafening after her words. For a moment, Tasha felt vulnerable, exposed, as if all her secrets had been laid bare for everyone to see. The prosecutor's eyes were hard, judgmental, but the judge seemed to hesitate for a moment. The tension was thick, as though the courtroom was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move. And then Layla stood up. Tasha's heart stopped. Her daughter, so small, so fragile, stood up in front of the gallery and walked toward the bench. Layla's steps were tentative at first, but with each step, the room seemed to hold its breath. Tasha's mind raced, panic coursing through her veins. What was Layla doing? Why was she standing up? She wasn't supposed to be part of this. But as Layla approached the judge, there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a determination that stunned everyone in the room. "Your Honor," Layla's small voice rang out, carrying in the silence like a bell. "My mom didn't mean to hurt anyone. She didn't want anyone to die. She's not a bad person. I know she's sorry. She loves me, and I love her. Please, don't take her away from me." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter's words, so pure, so raw, filled the room with a weight that no one could ignore. The judge seemed taken aback, his stern expression faltering for a moment as he processed what Layla had said. The room was still, each person in the courtroom absorbing the impact of those words. Layla wasn't just a child pleading for her mother's release. She was a living testament to the love and belief that still existed between them, despite everything. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze shifting between Layla and Tasha. He glanced down at his notes, his hand resting on the gavel. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The outcome was still uncertain, but Layla's courage had shifted something in the room. It was as if, for the first time, people were beginning to see the human side of this story. The mother, the daughter, the pain, the hope. The judge nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm as he spoke. "The court will take a brief recess before making a decision. I suggest that everyone take a moment to reflect on what has been said here today." As the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations, Tasha couldn't take her eyes off Layla. Her daughter had stood up for her, and in doing so, had given her the strength to keep going. It wasn't over yet, but this moment had changed everything. Tasha knew that no matter what happened next, this was the moment she would carry with her forever. The moment that proved that even in the darkest of times, love and redemption were still possible. A mother's redemption. The brief recess was a rare moment of respite in the otherwise tense courtroom, but it didn't provide much comfort to Tasha. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Layla's words still echoed in her ears, her daughter's plea for mercy ringing louder than anything the prosecution had said. Layla had spoken from the heart, in a way that only a child could, but it wasn't just the words themselves that had struck the room silent. It was the truth behind them. Layla believed in her. She believed that her mother was not the person everyone thought she was. And in that moment, Tasha realized that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for her daughter, for the future they could still have, even after everything had been shattered. The judge had adjourned the session for a short break, but no one in the courtroom seemed to be able to relax. The air was thick with tension, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. Tasha couldn't help but glance at Layla, who was now sitting back down beside Daniel. The little girl was calm now, but Tasha could see the strain in her eyes, the weariness of everything that had happened. Layla had never asked for this burden, but here she was, fighting for her mother with a courage that Tasha had never imagined in such a young child. Daniel, too, seemed unusually quiet, his face unreadable. Tasha had spent so many years resenting his detachment, but today she found herself hoping that something, anything, had shifted in him. He had been a distant figure in her life for so long, but seeing him here, next to their daughter, gave Tasha a strange sense of solace. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that he might finally see her for who she was now, not the woman who had run away that night, but someone willing to take responsibility, someone trying to make things right. The courtroom doors opened again, signaling the return of the judge. He entered with the same solemn expression that had dominated the trial, but there was something different in the air now, something heavier, as though the room itself was waiting for his decision. Tasha could feel her heart beating faster in her chest. This was it, the moment she had feared and yet desperately hoped for. The judge sat down and adjusted his glasses, his gaze sweeping across the room. The jury was silent, their eyes fixed on him. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what would come next. Tasha could barely hold herself together. She had spoken her truth. Layla had spoken hers. Now, all she could do was wait. After careful consideration of the arguments presented, the judge began, his voice calm but firm. And after hearing from the defendant, Tasha Davis, and her daughter, Layla, the court will render its final decision. The room fell silent once again, every eye locked on the judge. "Let me be clear," he continued, his tone serious. "What occurred on the night of the accident cannot be erased. 7 lives were lost, and no sentence, no apology can bring them back. But there is something else in this case that must be acknowledged. The willingness of the defendant to take full responsibility for her actions, the genuine remorse she has expressed, and the powerful testimony of her daughter, who has shown extraordinary courage in speaking out." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare move. Layla, too, sat stiffly, her little hands clutching the edge of the seat, her gaze fixed on the judge with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The court has reviewed the evidence, the statements, and the recommendations. The defendant, Tasha Davis, is not the same person who committed this crime. She has shown a remarkable commitment to rehabilitation, and she has the potential to make a positive impact in the future. This is not a decision made lightly, but it is one that is based on the belief that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that we must sometimes look beyond the worst moments of a person's life to see who they can become. Tasha's pulse was racing now. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Was this really happening? Had the judge heard her? Had he seen the change in her? The judge paused, his eyes meeting Tasha's for a long moment. It felt like an eternity, but Tasha didn't look away. She couldn't. If there was a chance for her, for Layla, for their future, this was it. She had to see this through. Therefore, the judge continued, the court hereby reduces the defendant's sentence. Tasha Davis will serve 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years, contingent on her successful completion of a rehabilitation program. The court recognizes the sincere efforts of the defendant to make amends, but justice must still be served. This sentence reflects the seriousness of the crime, but it also acknowledges the potential for redemption and change. Tasha's world seemed to stop in that moment. 10 years. It was still a long time, a heavy sentence to bear, but it wasn't life. It wasn't death. It was a chance, a real chance to prove that she could do better, that she could be the mother Layla believed her to be. Tasha blinked back tears, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know whether to cry or to shout with relief, but she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She could do this. She would do this. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp thud, signaling the end of the proceedings. "This court is adjourned," he declared, and with those words, the tension in the room began to dissipate. But for Tasha, it wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning. Her redemption had just begun, and she knew it would be the hardest road she had ever walked. She would have to face the trauma, the regret, the judgment, and the truth of who she was. But she was ready. As the courtroom slowly began to empty, Tasha looked over at Layla. Her daughter's face was streaked with tears, but there was something else in her eyes now, something brighter. It was the same look Layla had given her when she had stood up in the courtroom, that unwavering belief that her mother was not beyond saving. Layla was smiling, her small hands clasped together as she looked up at her mother with pride. Tasha walked over to where Layla was sitting, her heart racing. She knelt down beside her daughter and wrapped her arms around her tightly. Layla's tiny arms immediately went around her neck, and in that moment, the world outside the courtroom seemed to disappear. There was only this, her daughter, her love, her chance for a new beginning. "I'm so sorry, baby," Tasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll make it right. I promise." "I know you will, Mom," Layla whispered back, her voice full of quiet confidence. "I know you will." Tasha held her daughter close, feeling the warmth of her love, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that everything would be okay. It wouldn't be easy, but with Layla by her side and the chance to rebuild her life, she was ready to face whatever came next. This was her second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. A new beginning. The days following the trial felt like a whirlwind. The tension that had weighed down Tasha's every step was gone, but it had been replaced by something just as overwhelming. Hope. Hope was a strange feeling for her, one she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. But now, with the gavel's final thud still echoing in her ears, she felt it slowly creeping into her heart, filling the cracks that had formed after so much pain and regret. She was heading to prison, yes, but the difference now was that she wasn't going in as a defeated woman. She was going in with purpose. She was going to make something of herself, to prove that she could be the person her daughter believed her to be, not just for Layla, but for herself too. The first few weeks in prison were harder than Tasha had expected. The sterile, gray walls of the prison were a far cry from the sterile walls of the holding cell, and they felt like they were closing in on her from every side. The sounds of doors slamming shut, the guards barking orders, the constant shuffle of prisoners. It all felt like an endless reminder of everything she had lost. But she had been prepared for this. She knew that the road to redemption wasn't going to be smooth or easy. It was going to take everything she had, and then some. But even in the hardest moments, she never let herself forget the reason she was here, the reason she was willing to endure this. Layla, her daughter's face, was always in her mind, her smile a beacon in the darkness. Layla had stood up for her, had believed in her when no one else would. She owed it to Layla, and to herself, to prove that she could be more than the woman she had been. Natalie had arranged for her to start the rehabilitation program as soon as she was settled into the prison. It was part of the judge's order, and Tasha took it seriously. She didn't think of it as a way to shorten her sentence, although that was a part of it. Instead, she saw it as the first step toward healing. She had to confront the pain that had led her to that fateful night, the pain she had tried to numb for so long. The program was grueling. Every day, she was pushed to confront the darkest parts of herself. The addiction, the guilt, the overwhelming fear of failure. Each session brought up emotions she had buried deep inside. But it was also the first time in years that Tasha had felt like she was doing something to fix her life. Each small victory, each step toward understanding her past, each breakthrough in therapy, felt like a triumph. At first, the other inmates watched her warily. She was an outsider in many ways, a mother who had lost everything, someone who had committed a crime too great for many to forgive. Some of the women gave her cold looks, while others simply ignored her. Tasha didn't expect anything different, but what surprised her was how quickly she started to connect with some of the women in the program. There was a shared understanding of pain, of loss, of regret. And slowly, Tasha began to see that the road to healing wasn't just about facing herself. It was about connecting with others, too. There was one woman, Michelle, who had been in the program for a few months before Tasha arrived. Michelle had a tough exterior, But underneath it, there was a vulnerability that reminded Tasha of her own struggles. Michelle had been in and out of prison for years, battling a series of addictions that had ruined her life. But she had turned a corner, and now she was trying to rebuild. Tasha and Michelle quickly formed an unexpected bond, both women struggling with their own demons, but finding strength in each other's presence. Michelle became one of the few people Tasha could confide in, someone who understood the internal battles she was fighting. During their long walks around the prison yard, Michelle would talk to her about the importance of forgiveness, not just for the people she had hurt, but for herself. "We're all here for a reason," Michelle had said during one of their conversations. "We've all made mistakes, but it's how we deal with those mistakes that defines who we are now. You can't change the past, but you can change the future. And that's what matters." Tasha took Michelle's words to heart. The pain of the accident, the lives lost, and her own mistakes would always be a part of her. But she could choose what came next. She could choose to be better, to prove that redemption was more than just a word. It was a possibility. And it was a possibility she was determined to make real. Months passed. Each day in prison was a test of endurance, but also a test of resilience. Tasha began to change in ways she hadn't expected. She stopped focusing solely on the sentence hanging over her head and started focusing on what she could control. She attended every therapy session, worked hard in the rehabilitation program, and found herself slowly letting go of the shame that had held her hostage for so long. Every time she took a step forward, Layla's face filled her thoughts, her daughter's belief in her pushing her to keep going. Layla's visits were the highlight of her life. The little girl's face was always a source of light, her smile never dimming, even when the weight of the world seemed to rest on Tasha's shoulders. The visits were difficult for both of them, each one a reminder of the distance between them. Tasha hated seeing Layla walk away after every visit, but she knew that as long as she kept working, kept improving, they would one day be together again. One day, Layla wouldn't have to visit her mother in a cold, sterile prison. They would have a life beyond these walls, a life of second chances. Layla had changed too. She had grown in ways Tasha could see, and in ways that Tasha couldn't fully understand yet. Daniel, while still distant, had stepped up to be a stable presence in Layla's life. Tasha was grateful for that, even if it didn't erase the past. She could see that Layla was thriving, her grades improving, her spirit intact. But Tasha knew that the hurt wouldn't fade overnight. She had a long road ahead of her, and Layla did too. But that didn't mean it was impossible. Layla was strong, and she had a mother who was finally beginning to understand what it meant to truly fight for her. One day, several months into her rehabilitation program, Tasha was called into the counselor's office. Her heart skipped a beat as she entered. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Carla, had been guiding her through the tough parts of the program, and Tasha had made steady progress. But today was different. Today, Carla had something important to tell her. "Tasha," Carla said, a slight smile on her face, "I've been reviewing your progress, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've worked hard, and I can see the changes in you. You've faced your past, taken responsibility, and shown a genuine commitment to growth. I believe you're ready for parole." The words hit Tasha like a wave, a mixture of disbelief, hope, and fear. She had worked so hard to get to this point, but to hear those words, "ready for parole," was something she hadn't allowed herself to dream of. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a huge milestone. She felt a lump rise in her throat, but she fought it back. I don't know what to say." "Thank you." Carla nodded. "You've earned this, Tasha. The next steps are in motion. It won't be easy, and you'll still need to prove yourself, but you've given yourself a real chance. The road to redemption isn't a straight line, but you've taken the first crucial steps." Tasha left the counselor's office with a mix of emotions swirling inside her: hope, relief, and the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The decision was only the first part of her journey, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be hurdles, still moments when the old feelings would try to creep back in. But for the first time, in a long time, she felt like she had a future worth fighting for. As she walked down the prison corridor, a sense of determination filled her. She wasn't the same woman who had walked in here all those months ago. She had grown. She had changed. And most importantly, she had learned what it meant to fight, for herself, for Layla, and for the possibility of a better life. Her past didn't define her anymore. What mattered now was the future, and she was ready to face it, no matter what it took.